Admiral Mike Rogers, thanks so much for joining us from Munich here at the Cipher Brief.
Hey, thanks for the opportunity.
It's nice to see you. I'm really interested to know, what are some of the big themes that are really emerging from this year's conference?
Well, I thought this year you really had about four major focus areas. The first clearly was the Ukraine situation.
Yep.
And that's why President Zelensky was here, for example. The second, really, the question about Russia and its direction forward. You just had the death, of Alia. You have a little Russian election coming up. So the second area, I would say, is really what's going on in Russia and what's the future and its meaning for the rest of the world. The third, really, in some ways, the U.S. political dynamic. Lots of concern and question about, so what's going on in the United States? What are the implications for Europe? How do you see this playing out? And then finally, kind of related, but more broadly, just so what's the future of Europe? What should its structure look like? What should its role be? How does it best position itself for the broader world around us? And, those are the four primary takeaways. But remember, it's a global conference. So you had nations, groups, individuals, literally from all over the world. So there were discussions about Palestine, Gaza, and Hamas, discussions about China, Taiwan, the U.S.-China relationship, et cetera. We're all definitely addressed here, but I wouldn't define them as the primary issues, so to speak.
I'd love to dig in with you for just a minute on the future of Europe. What are European leaders thinking about? Are they thinking about a future with a U.S. that maybe isn't as reliable as a partner as it has been in the past via NATO? Or am I putting words in their mouth? You tell me what you're hearing.
Well, no, I mean, look, there has been a dialogue that's been going on for a long time now, multiple decades, about, number one, what is the appropriate security mechanism for Europe? Is it the NATO alliance? Is it building off the EU as not just a political entity or an economic entity, but also as a security entity? That those discussions tend to flow and ebb over the course of the last decade or so. I would argue with an increasing concern here in Europe about, okay, what we hear from at least one of the two primary, it appears, presidential candidates is real concern about NATO, Europe, the alliance, America potentially led, were former President Trump to win the election. And again, it's not yet a formally candidate, but were he to win an election if he was running, I mean, that clearly has a lot of Europeans questioning, so what are the implications for us? Do we need to look at an alternative? Can we count on the Americans? Can we count on the United States?
Yeah, I'm going to think that Ukraine, Russia, you mentioned that as one of your very top things right off the top of the big themes this year. Any sort of new ideas being thrown around about how to address this? Or I'm guessing that the death of Alexei Navalny really did kind of heighten the awareness of some of the risks in terms of how Vladimir Putin is running the country.
Yeah, I mean, I think the dialogue you just tended to hear was, number one, can Ukraine count on the West, the EU, the United States, NATO, other nations? Can Ukraine count on continued financial, military, and political support from the rest of the world as it executes its fight on the ground and in the air against the forces of Russia that have illegally invaded their nation? So lots of questions about that. I think lots of questions as well as, so when does this end? How does it end? What's the mechanism to end it? Does it end? Or does this become a sort of long-term standing conflict or a frozen conflict? You'll often hear, some people like to use the analogy of, well, does this become a situation like South and North Korea, where quite frankly, we have an armistice, but we have never formally ended that conflict. And we have the most heavily fortified border in the world with literally, a million troops on either side. Hey, does that play out in Ukraine? I certainly hope not.
Yeah. Is anybody talking about China?
Oh, plenty of discussion. Now, you had the Chinese foreign minister was here, the Secretary Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, as well as his Chinese foreign minister counterpart, used the opportunity, since they were both here in Munich. Both nations have confirmed that the two individuals met. So there's been discussion on the margins of the conference. It's one of the things that makes the Munich Security Conference so valuable, is it becomes a convening place for just a breadth of nations around the world. And so many of those nations use this as a vehicle to engage in discussions with each other. And that's a very positive thing.
Yeah. Have you heard anything that's surprised you so far that you maybe didn't expect when you were going into the conference?
Nothing that Well, the one thing that surprised me was the death, sadly, in Russia. I just thought, why would Putin have picked this to occur? Because, folks, I have no known inside information. I'll just give you my sense, having dealt with the Russians and the Soviets for decades, and having paid great attention to Vladimir Putin in my previous life as the director of the National Security Agency. This wasn't a natural death. He, I think, was clearly killed, murdered. One of my surprises was, wow, why would he elect to do this in the middle of the Munich Security Conference? Again, to me, it goes to show you his arrogance, his detachment from reality, and the fact that I think he also wanted to send a very broad signal to the broader world. There is no alternative in Russia to Vladimir Putin, in Vladimir Putin's mind, and he won't accept any alternatives.
Yeah, well, it would definitely send a message that what are you going to do about it? Let me go back to your previous role as the head of Cybercom and the head of the National Security Agency. Has there been a lot of talk on the sidelines there about sort of cyber tech? I know that you mentioned there's another conference that's adjoined to this one, but AI is all the buzz. Is that still the situation there as well?
Yeah, so while you didn't hear as much about cyber directly at the Munich Security Conference, that's because in part the conference has created a related gathering. It actually occurs the day before the MSC itself starts, called the Munich Cybersecurity Conference. I participated in that for the day and a half it's on. That really is the primary forum for cybersecurity. What you did see at the Munich Security Conference, though, was an element about, so what are the national security dimensions of technology? And within the broad scope of technology, very high interest, lots of discussion about what are the implications for artificial intelligence, what are the implications of AI from a national security perspective, as well as from an economic and a societal, kind of impact perspective.
Yeah. Let me ask you, NATO, I'm sure you're aware, has been really focused on understanding how to better invest in future national security. I think taking some lessons from the United States. I know there are a lot of, this booming industry of private sector investors who are interested in dual use technologies. Do you sense that there's a lot of interest around those issues as well, as we're kind of seeing the private sector really lead the way when it comes to the development of these technologies?
Yeah, I think very much so. I think there's a realization in Europe that industrial capacity, both for many of the traditional kind of commodities associated with national security, certainly the commodities like artillery, mortars, ammunition, etc., grenades, the challenges that are really proving to be a limiting factor right now on the battlefield in Ukraine. But I think not only you're seeing that, but you're also seeing a discussion about, so what are the implications of industrial policy? What are the implications for us economically in terms of how Europe plays a role in the creation of some of these kind of foundational technologies that are going to shape the future? And so I think clearly Europe has come to the conclusion, look, they need to invest in it. They need to create alternatives here in Europe so they aren't just reliant on a China or the United States, for example.
Fascinating discussions. I want to thank you so much, Admiral Mike Rogers, for taking a couple of moments here to share your insights from inside the Munich Security Conference with us here at the Cipher Brief. It's nice to see you.
No, thank you. It's always good to talk to you. Have a great day.